I can't give you, I will give you what the calculation of what that would do to the average replacement rate, but you can see that it's a substantial cut. Each year that you raise the retirement age is an additional 6.5% cut in benefits.
So I would say, just offhand, thinking out loud, 39 to 28, 11%. If you went to 70 from 67, that's 3 more years rather than 2 years. You got to have a replacement rate down in the teens someplace, I would think. Mr. Vanderhee, am I very off on that?
It would certainly be the high teens.
Pardon?
It would certainly be the high teens. I'm just trying to do this back of the envelope right now.
I am just doing that too, but it would be somewhere less than 20%. So we would have gone from a 39% replacement rate to somewhere down in the teens. Now, for someone who has been in the upper income brackets and stuff, not a big deal. You could absorb that. But how does Ms. Miller? How does someone who's earning $35,000, $40,000, $45,000 a year, how do they absorb that replacement rate? I mean, their standard of living is really going to fall. Really going to fall. Is that right, Mr. Eisenberg?
That's right, and I think the figures that Mr. Vanderhee gave you on how close people are to poverty, this would push millions of people into poverty. We've done a fairly good job as a nation of taking care of elderly poverty. It used to be very high before Social Security, but as benefits are cut, there's no question that more and more people will be pushed into dire circumstances.
Both you and Dr. Vanderhee have talked about the decline of the defined benefit plan system, the rise of 401ks. Here's a book I've read. I keep referring it to people, The Great Risk Shift by Jacob Hacker. And there's a whole section in there about this issue, about going from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans. But what I can't seem to get my hands on is when did this take place and why? Why don't more employers want to offer defined benefit pension plans anymore? When did this take place and why? Mr. Vanderhee and then Mr. Eisenberg, give me some context here.
I would say you'd have to go all the way back to 1974 with the enactment of ERISA to get a full story. And keep in mind that in November of 1981, proposed regulations were released that allowed 401k plans to basically develop the way they have. You've had many things happen since 1974 which have made defined benefit plans less and less attractive for employers due to certain constraints on funding flexibility. And one of the problems that happened in the mid-1980s was because of the deficit, there was a problem when they were trying to deal with PBGC problems. There was a huge underfunding for PBGC, and they wanted to make sure underfunded defined benefit plans would be increasing their minimum funding standards. The problem is if minimum funding standards go up for that portion of the defined benefit population, that means more contributions, more tax deductions, more revenue losses. So a decision was made, I believe 86 or 87, that to counter the revenue loss for increasing minimum funding standards for underfunded plans, there would be a temporary holiday on deductible contributions for overfunded plans, roughly defined as any plan that had more than 50% more assets than they needed to cover their liabilities. I do believe the thought was you give plans a holiday of 1, 2, 3, 5, 7 years, and when that funding ratio came back down to 150% eventually, that employers would start making their deductible contributions to these overfunded defined benefit plans. Unfortunately, if you talk to many, many pension consultants, when that day finally came, when the pension holiday window had evaporated, surprise, employers had found other things to do with the money they were making as far as contributions to their defined benefit plan. They had rethought from an HR perspective, from a strategy perspective, whether or not they really wanted to continue to pre-fund defined benefit plans to that extent. The problem is, and I worked on some of the initial modeling with PBGC for the PIMS model, we all knew that sooner or later you would get the perfect storm, which we ran into. When discount rates go down extremely low, historical lows, you saw what happened in the stock market, you saw what happened with respect to bankruptcies, and basically when all these things happen together and the ability to pre-fund for those days was severely constrained, that you now have a number of people who used to think sponsoring defined benefit plans made sense in a financial situation where the volatility of what just the absolute minimum contribution you have to make every year to keep this tax qualified can jump around severely. Now, there was a lot of attempts to deal with this in 2006 as part of PPA. I think some of these are still being worked out. But to be perfectly honest with you, I think the volatility, not only in cash contributions, but also in the way these things are accounted for through FASB, has scared away a large number of employers. And if they didn't just outright terminate the plan, the thing that they have been doing, and I'm sure you're well aware, is they have been freezing accruals, certainly for new employees, and maybe in some cases also existing employees.
Well, that's a pretty good rundown. Mr. Eisenberg, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, I think that's all true, and there are many other causes. The decline of unionization. Unions, as you know, are much more likely to have a unionized workforce is more likely to have a defined benefit pension plan. There was a huge wave of terminations in the 80s during the merger and acquisition craze when employers leveraged buyout corporate raiders could seize another company's pension plan, could take it over in a hostile takeover and then raid the plan. That went on and for a long time before Congress intervened to stop it. Bankruptcy law allows employers to terminate their pension plans, that, even when they have a collective bargaining agreement. That's a contribution. The terrible industrial decline. Manufacturing companies were the most likely to have pension plans, and the steel industry lost its plans. Right now, the auto industry, has as a part of the bailout of the auto industry, agreed to put into place for new employees defined contribution plans. Existing, the older employees have their DB plans. The deregulation in the late 70s of the transportation industry was a huge contributor because it allowed startup companies without legacy costs to compete against the older carriers who had these obligations, and they could be low-cost competitors. And then finally, when health benefit promises were forced onto balance sheets where they hadn't, companies didn't have to report them as a liability in the past, but when those rules changed and companies suddenly had to report these huge retiree benefit obligations, that was one of the things that employers realized that they had to do with their money, and it made them want to take money out of their pension plan and put it into the retiree obligation. So there are just a host of causes for this.
I'll think more about that. Senator Sanders.
Mr. Chairman, we're not going to go into great length today on this issue, but I hope at some point we can discuss the growing income inequality in America and what that means not only from a moral sense, but from an economic sense as well. Mr. Eisenberg, you write in your statement that 55% of all income gains over the last 30 years have gone to the top 1%. Got that? 55% of all income gains over the last 30 years have gone to the top 1%, while the bottom 90% have only received 16%, i.e. the people on top become much wealthier, middle class collapses. Now, we can talk about that from a moral point of view, from an economic point of view, But let's talk about it a little bit from a Social Security point of view. How has the growing income inequality in our country impacted the solvency of Social Security? Mr. Eisenbrain?
Simply, as more and more income has shifted to higher income people, income above the cap, above the taxable wage base, it means Social Security is getting a smaller and smaller share of GDP. And I think going forward, the trustees suggest, and the Social Security actuary says, that if we just return to where we were in 1983 and tax 90% of income, right now we're at about 84%, I think, of income is being taxed. If we returned going forward, we would close about a third of the gap for Social Security's funding. So this is an enormous problem, and that would be going forward. But we've lost, in the past 20 years or so, we've lost a lot of money that should have been raised on that tremendous income growth of very wealthy people.
Well, that takes us to another point that you make in your statement. You say, quote, most Americans don't realize that someone with a salary of $300,000 or even $30 million a year pays no more in Social Security taxes than someone earning roughly $107,000, end of quote. What is the implication of that toward making sure Social Security is solvent for the next 75 years? What do you suggest that we might want to do about that?
Well, my institute, the Economic Policy Institute, recommends that we take the cap off entirely for employers, so that high-income people, the way we do now for Medicare, that the employer pay the tax on the entire income, the entire salary that's paid to high-income people, and that for on the employee side, that we raise the cap, that we don't take it off entirely, but that we raise the cap, perhaps to restore it to the level that it was in 1983, where 90% of income would be captured. And that by itself would nearly would close more than 3/4 of the entire remaining gap in Social Security funding for the next 75 years.
So in other words, with fairly modest changes, Social Security would be solvent for perhaps the next 70 or 75 years.
That's right.
Okay.
Can I follow up on it? Okay, I have to understand this. You said if we returned to 1983 and taxed it at 90% of income, you'd close about a third of the gap. Then I just heard you say something about closing 75% of the gap.
Well, I'm proposing something more radical from the point of view of wealthy Americans than just returning to where we were in 1983. At that point, we did not tax, employers were not required to pay the tax on the entire salary that they paid to an employee. That, it was, now it's capped at $106,800.
Right.
I'm suggesting that employers pay on the entire salary.
But
and that would take us.
The employee does not match that. The employee only pays up to a certain
Right.
amount.
The employee would only contribute 6.2% up to, let's say, $140,000. I'm not sure what the calculation would be now, but it would be a higher figure than it is.
But Social Security has also always been predicated on equal employer-employee, right? Contribution.
Well, the tax rate would be, the 6.2% would be the same for employer and employee, but employers, I'm suggesting,
Income.
should pay more.
How would that affect self-employed?
They would have to pay more, too.
Mr. Chairman, let me, if I can get back to Mr. Eisenbrain. Mr. Eisenbrain, in your testimony, you say that, quote, 45% of older workers last year were employed in physically demanding jobs or jobs with difficult working conditions, end of quote. How difficult would it be for these workers to work until they're 70 years of age? Isn't it a little bit absurd to be suggesting that people who are doing very physically demanding work, A, would they have jobs when they're 68 or 69, and would anybody hire them? And second of all, what happens to them in terms of their health if they're working to 69.